Hi, Jenny. Thanks so much for coming on the podcast this morning. I'll ask you the first question that I always ask. What's the hardest change that you've been through?
Well, I gave this a lot of thought because I've been through quite a lot of changes in my life. But I think the hardest one was 2009. And I'd just come back from maternity leave with my second daughter. So I had a baby and I had a preschooler. And I was made redundant. I was also the only wage earner in the household. So it was hugely challenging. And of course, in 2009, we were right in the middle of a recession. It was austerity. We just had the financial crisis and so on. And I was living in a part of the country where there weren't a lot of jobs around, and particularly the kind of jobs that I had done up until then. So I'd tended to sort of I'd worked in higher education, and it had always been in sort of the big partnership projects, which are publicly funded or from European funding, which we used to have. Um, that was all just starting to dry up with austerity. So it was a very, very challenging time. Ironically, it was the first time in my career really that I'd had a permanent job. I'd always been on fixed term contracts, but I'd always had, great job security. There was always lots going on. So yeah, so it was just like hitting a brick wall, really. It was very, very challenging. Um, but I couldn't really afford to miss a beat. I had to just make money so that we, could eat food and keep a roof over our heads and so on. So I sort of pivoted to consultancy, which I had done before, but I'd done it before in the context of being single and having no children. And this was a very different sort of proposition. Um, so I did that. I got a consultancy, well, two consultancy businesses off the ground with just so much help from some amazing people and people who were willing to give me work. But it was an incredibly stressful time, and I was listening to one of your podcasts with Mel, who said, "Yeah, you always have to live like a pauper when you've got your own business," and it was very much like that. And it just got so exhausting after a couple of years. I remember I was up in Scotland. I wasn't sure if I was going to share this story, but I will do. I was up in Scotland and I was doing a piece of consultancy work up there, and I had this suitcase with wheels, as we all do now, and one of the wheels broke. So just a tiny little thing. If you've got some money in the bank, it's great because you can just go and buy another suitcase. And the people I was with were saying, "Oh, no, you're going to have to get a new case." And I just smiled and nodded because I knew there was only enough in the bank to cover our bills, and there was nothing else. And that was only if one of my clients paid me on time, which you can never guarantee anyway. So there was no chance I was going to buy another suitcase um, anytime soon. So I was just going to have to like lug my stuff by hand around, and it was such a low moment, um, because you feel kind of cut off from people. You can't say, "Oh yeah, no, I can't afford to buy a suitcase," because people would think you were, I don't know, they would just look at you like you came from a different planet. So I didn't tell anyone. But it was also on that trip that I was thinking, "God, you know what, I just need to get a job. How am I going to get a job?" And I'd put a few feelers out and nothing. And I read, I was on the Guardian jobs board, and there was a very kind of cryptic advert for a job saying there's a blue chip client who wants someone to improve their relationships with the higher education sector. And I thought, oh, I could do that. Because I'd spent quite a lot of time sort of making other sectors like higher education. I thought, well, maybe I could make higher education like whoever this is, as long as they're, a good company. And it turned out to be Unite Students, who I'd never heard of. in the student accommodation, private student accommodation sector, which I'd never heard of and didn't know existed. But I thought, well, I had a great time in my own accommodation when I was at university. I was at Durham University, so I was in student accommodation for 3 years, and I had the greatest time. So I felt quite strongly about it, and then kind of the rest is history. So that's the change and the challenge and the many low points that we went through as a family before I got the job at Unite Students. So that's the change. So that's quite a long-winded one, but it was quite a journey.
No, and thanks for sharing that story. And I wonder, obviously, you say that was back in 2009, and
Mm.
I wonder if you'd be more comfortable sharing that in, well, I nearly said 2023. Then we're now in 2024, but I wonder if we, things have changed a little bit, where people are more open about sharing
Yeah.
their struggles. Although perhaps in maybe not in the social media world, we all try to project an image of everything's great and we're all doing really well, and actually
Mm.
it's really tough. So I wonder if you think would you be comfortable sharing that with other colleagues if you were having those troubles now, or not?
I think I probably would now. Yeah, I'm quite a private person, so goodness knows why I'm doing this podcast, honestly, Gareth. But I'm going to be as open as I can today. I think maybe now is the time. But yeah, I think people are more open now. But I think it's also there's a bit of a I think there's a bit of a pressure to be a bit performative about it. So I definitely feel that. And I know I see myself putting things on LinkedIn. I put something on LinkedIn the other day about imposter syndrome. And I really kind of felt quite passionately about it. But I was aware of being a little bit performative as well. So you kind of have to question your motives as well. And I also have that fear of, is this coming across as inauthentic? Am I just some other person putting some nice words out on the social media? So that I think there is that. I think we probably all feel like we're in a bit of a glass cage and people are looking at us and we have to perform. I don't know.
Talking of performing, so
Yes.
when I was obviously researching this episode, um, and you were talking about your time at Durham, I was interested in, so growing up in Hull, you were making your money as a busker, and then you went
I
to
was.
Durham to study maths. I'm wondering about
Yeah.
how, how that journey came about.
I don't know really. I I don't even remember sort of agonizing over the decision as what to do in the way that my daughters are doing, because I think they feel like they've got loads and loads of opportunities, and it there's just this pressure to make the right decision. But I mean, there was no internet in those days, and you you just picked something and went with it. And I can remember the conversation. I had a conversation with my dad when I was applying to university, and I said, I don't know what to do at university. And he said, well, the thing you're best at is maths, which was true at the time. Maybe not so much now. And I said, oh, I could go and do maths, couldn't I? He says, well, do you like maths? I said, yeah, I really like it. So that's what I did. But of course, then when I got there, I could saw these other really cool subjects. So I did sort of change tracks so that I could broaden out what I was doing.
And so I guess you come on to some of your other interests later, but it
Mm.
seemed like, well, you talk about writing and music as being your passions,
Mm.
and clearly you were interested in being creative and music at that time, and that's why I was quite surprised when I saw that, obviously talk about going to study maths. Like, you talk about there being no internet and not being able to think about opportunities at that time, but were you not keen to pursue music as a passion at that time, or did it not seem like something you could turn into a career, perhaps?
Yeah, I think that was it. It didn't really occur to me that I could make a career out of it. And I think because I tended to like quite niche music. um, and I could play. I played classical piano, but I wasn't that good. I mean, I sort of went through all the grades, but I was never, a sort of musical prodigy. And I knew a lot of other musicians who were a lot better than me. So it never felt like, yeah, this is my shining talent, and I'm going to go and be a concert pianist, because that would have never worked. But I think as well, because both of my parents uh, studied um, the science subject, so they both studied geology at university. So it was kind of what people did in my head.
And then you went on to be a librarian at a school in London.
Well, that was a case of I need a job, and that I could. I mean, honestly, I was looking. I was thinking about this. I was looking back. I mean, at 21, I'd never had an actual job. I'd never been employed. I mean, I'd done a lot of things, but I'd never been employed. So I had no useful skills whatsoever. And goodness knows why anyone ever employed me, because I didn't know how to be an employee at all. Um, so I sort of somehow got talked my way into this job. Um, and I'm not sure I was very good at it, but it was definitely an education. It was a big secondary school in West London. It was incredibly diverse, and I got to meet some really amazing people. I learned so much from the kids. I learned so much from the teachers. It was great. Um, and I think I did make some changes, and some positive things happened, but I don't think I was a great employee, honestly. I had a lot to learn.
So you went from Hull to Durham to London. So did you move to
Yeah,
London at that time, or?
I did. Yeah, I spent quite a lot of my time at university saying, I'm not going to move to London like everyone else does. I'm not going to do that. And then I moved to London.
And you talked about your post about imposter syndrome, which I found
Yeah.
really interesting, and there's a lot of people talking about it at the moment. So how does that sort of manifest itself for you? Like is it before you go and do a podcast? Is it before you,
Uh,
how does that, I say physically affect you, but mentally affect you? Like when do you say, oh, I'm feeling a bit at the moment?
think it's I think it's self-doubt. Um, just a constant self-doubt and self-undermining. So, you know, coming into a podcast like this, and I can tell you loads of things about my life. And I've had quite an interesting career, but there's always a little voice saying, oh, no one cares. you know it's not interesting. No one wants to know what you want to say. And it's crazy, because I stand on platforms and give presentations and I do all that, but there's always that little voice saying, nah, no one wants to know. So you just got to find ways to quell it. But it does take a toll. It's exhausting.
And
And
how?
I haven't found the switch to switch it off yet. But I think what I realized is that a lot of other people feel the same way. And I think I think different people have different sort of flavors of imposter syndrome. But it's always, I think, that little voice that's trying to undermine you and sees your faults and wants to take you down. And I was just sort of playing with how you turn that around, and how you sort of make a virtue of what you see as your own weaknesses.
So you talk about quelling it. How do you quell your imposter syndrome?
I don't think I do, actually. I think I just carry on regardless. It's like the cost of doing business.
I think it's interesting about that because clearly some people don't have that. I would certainly put myself in the camp of having that. I don't look forward to public speaking and big groups of people and talking in front of them. But like you say, it's something you have to do. But I do wonder if there is ever a solution, or whether you're just stuck with that for life.
Yeah, maybe it's a feature, not a fault, because I'm trying to think, and I think the post really reflects that. I'm trying to think about, okay, so what are the upsides? Because it means you don't get overconfident, you don't come across as being arrogant, or it gives you a level of emotional intelligence, I think. um yeah, I think I'm very early on this journey, but I think I'm starting to see the positives of it.
I think it makes me incredibly prepared. I have to prepare for everything.
Yes. Yeah, I've got notes here. I've got notes.
I have to, overthink everything before I go and do it. Whether it's,
Yeah.
I took my son to a new swimming lesson last night, and I'm overthinking. I've never been there before. Where is it? So, I'm thinking I've got to talk to the teacher about, all the things he can and
Yeah.
can't do, and even little things like that. You think
Yeah.
I should know all this stuff, and I don't. So it makes me incredibly prepared. But
I think that's exhausting. I think that's the really exhausting part of it, is the having to think through all the conversations before you have them, and then
yeah,
sometimes, not always, but sometimes then your brain kind of makes you review them afterwards and say, why did you say that? What did they think when you said that? It's exhausting. And I think it's sometimes I think it's something that comes on when you're under stress anyway. It's just a sort of an extra little thing that your brain throws at you. But
I think
it can be really
exhausting is definitely the word.
tiring.
And you talked about, how that, before you go and speak and, talk to people or anything. And, you know, I think many people, most people, and this is just my opinion, so you can tell me if I'm wrong, would consider you as someone that is influential in the sector and has a voice that people listen to, and but do you see yourself as that person or not?
No, not really. Not really. Just bumbling along. Um, yeah, I think I see myself as a person who is always trying to change things. So, I thought that was quite interesting in terms of sort of the mission of this podcast, that my mission is just to change things for the better. Um, whether that makes me an influencer or not, I think the best way to change things is to change people's minds about things. So I think that's really the driver for a lot of the work I do, and the getting up and standing up in front of people and doing all those scary things, because stories change the world. If you can get an idea into someone's head, it changes the way they think, and then it changes what they do and how they approach things, and that's how you get real change in this sector, and more widely.
You get frustrated when people won't change their minds.
Do I get frustrated?
Yeah.
I don't know. I feel like I've been the kind of things I've been working on. It's not been that there's not been a huge number of barriers. I mean, it's very much going with the flow, and I think that's one thing that I seem to have been able to do over the years, is to catch something at a very early stage. When people are just maybe starting to think about or talk about something like student mental health, and just really kind of find ways to push that forward. So I'm very much going with the flow, I think. Similarly with the work we did on Living Black at university, it just felt like it kind of caught the mood and turned it into something really concrete.
So going back to you said you had a fantastic experience in your student
Yeah.
accommodation. Um, what was fantastic about it, and what have you taken from that into the work that you do now?
Well, I think probably the first thing is the context, because I grew up in a council house, and I had a great childhood. I enjoyed it a lot, but it was quite a small house, and it was not necessarily the greatest area. So to go to Durham and be there, and to have this room which seemed to me quite luxurious. I mean, I'm sure students of today wouldn't think that, but it seemed quite luxurious to me. It didn't have an ensuite, but it had its own sink, and I'd never seen that before. So I felt like I was living in the lap of luxury in this amazing place, and um, it was incredibly social, but everything was run by students, so it was quite old school. You know, it was sort of JCR, and they had a events committee and all sorts of things. I was never confident enough to get involved in that at all. I mean, there were all these middle class kids there who had this endless confidence and knew how to do things, and I just let them get on with it. But it was a great time, and you know, just being surrounded by other students, and everyone was really lovely. It was a great time. And you know, it was all catered as well, so you just go down for your dinner. It was like, I imagine what it would be like to go to a private school or something like that. It wasn't quite Hogwarts because it was one of the new colleges, but it was halfway there, you know.
I find that amazing. But given the work that you do now in shaping
Mm,
policy, and
yeah.
and the work you do with Unite, obviously the largest provider, yet you didn't have the confidence to get involved in the junior common room committee. I think people
No.
would be surprised to hear that about you.
I was, you know what, I was very shy as a child, and I didn't have a lot of social confidence, and it, it's, you know, obviously I did get over that, but at times of stress, it's something that social anxiety still comes back. So it's not gone altogether. And again, I think people would be very surprised because I'm quite good at faking it. Um, but yeah, I wasn't very confident. I was a little bit quiet still when I went to university. And also I think, you know, I came from that sort of working class context, and I was expecting to meet posh people at university, but I didn't quite realize how how many sort of grades of middle classness there was between me and the posh kids. So um, there were all these, you know, very confident grammar school kids from the south of England, and sort of taking up space and doing their thing, and that was great. I mean, fair play to them, and they had such a sort of service ethos. They ran stuff brilliantly. I don't think I would have done quite as good a job, so let them crack on. But my goodness, I just went there, and everyone knew what to do. Everyone knew how to talk to everyone else, and I didn't really. So just sort of found my own way.
Maybe they were faking it as well. Like I think
Well,
that
there might have been, yeah.
I think that was certainly my university experience, uh,
Mm,
betraying confidence that perhaps I didn't have at the time. Um,
yeah.
but
Maybe we're all faking it.
so so your daughter's planning to head off to university, um,
Yeah,
and given all the ins and outs of, of the positives and the hard bits of
yeah,
university, so from a parent's point of view, what's that like, knowing your daughter's about to go off to university, particularly with your sort of inside knowledge of the sector. Um,
mm,
are you nervous about her going? And what advice would you give to parents about sending their
oh,
child off to university? I asked you lots of questions there. Sorry.
yeah. You can see I've got my processing face on. Um, yeah, there's a lot of things I can say about this, and I'm trying to think about it because she's an adult, so I don't want to sort of say things about her too much because I sort of want to protect that. But I think the first thing to say is sort of having overseen the student support team at Unite for several years, I know all the things that can go wrong with students, you know, right up to the most tragic things. So I was always going to feel nervous about my kids going to university because I know what can happen. Um, so that I think that's going to cause me maybe some sleepless nights. I think also because my daughter has had mental health issues as a teenager. She's doing okay at the moment, but that hasn't always been the case. So I think it will be challenging for me as a parent. But what I do know is really how committed universities are to supporting students, and just how much that is resourced compared to when I went to university, where it was barely apparent, really. So it's a mixture of being terrified and being reassured. We'll have to see. I think that moment when we drive away and leave her there, I think that's when it will hit home. Anything could happen.
um,
I know too much.
yes, yeah, I feel the same, albeit my children are very young, but
Yeah.
yeah, I definitely feel the same. And you talk about widening access and participation, and and
Yeah.
that's really important to you, clearly. Um,
Yeah.
why? Why is it important to you?
It I think it's a matter of fairness. So anything that seems not fair really makes me annoyed. I'm not an angry, annoyed sort of person, but unfairness really makes me annoyed. So I think there's that. I think it was just where I grew up as well, because my parents were graduates. They'd gone to university from a working class background. Um, so we were a sort of a graduate household, but in the context of lots and lots of people who didn't go to university. And I found out later, because I worked in Hull for a while, partway through my career, that the estate I grew up on, 1 in 2,000 people went to university.
Wow.
And I thought about all the people that I knew, particularly at primary school in the local area, and just all the talents they had as children, and kind of what happened to that later. And there's the story I've told before, in the context of the Unite Foundation. So I was part of the team that sort of brought the Unite Foundation to life in its early days. But I remember we had a little recorder class at our school, as many schools did, so that we could torture our parents with our recorder playing. And it was something I was really into, obviously being a musician. But there were these two little girls who were part of that group, um, and used to come along with their recorders. And I remember one day they were standing outside of the class crying because their mum had told them that they weren't allowed to play recorder anymore. And there's just something about that kind of ingrained fear about doing things different or getting on, that kind of holds people back. And to me, that was a real something I look back on in later life and thought, just how people limit themselves, and how they can limit their children because of fear of, you can't do that, posh girls do that, or whatever it might be. It's not for the likes of us. And that still happens, and maybe not quite in the same way as it did in whenever that was, 1980 or something, but there's sort of different flavors and different versions of that for sort of different groups in society. It's not for us. And that fear of rejection as well. If we put ourselves into this place, we'll be rejected. So I think there's just something about, it's not just fairness, and it's not just, oh yeah, give everyone the same opportunities and they'll get the same outcome. It's not like that, because there's those ways of thinking and ways of believing and seeing yourself, and ways that other people might see you, that just close doors at every stage. That's a very esoteric answer to your question, but it really makes me sad when people can't pursue things that they are good at or they're passionate about because of these different barriers. So some of it is about their own beliefs, and that sort of raising aspiration, as we used to call it. And some of it is about practical support. So that's something that we do in the Unite Foundation. If you haven't got the support of family, if you've been in care, if you're estranged from your parents, we're going to step in and pay for your accommodation, and we're going to give you support, and we're going to connect you with others, and we're going to do everything we can alongside your university to make sure you can go to university and you can do well, and you can have that sort of supportive group around you.
So for those, you talked about people in on the estate that you grew up in, those that,
Mm,
you know, may want to go to university but don't because of some of the reasons
yeah.
you've talked about. You know, clearly there's lots of work to do there. Um,
Mm,
does it start in with parents? Does it start with teachers? You know, because I remember going back to, you know,
mm,
I went to a grammar school in a very small town in Lincolnshire, yet still the aspiration was quite low. You know, if
yeah.
I, you know, I remember careers advisors back in the day. I know it's changed a lot because my wife works in a multi academy trust of schools on
Mm.
careers. But what can we do at that sort of, you know, before they're even thinking about going to university with parents and maybe teachers or leaders in schools to get people to see that?
I feel like there's so many things that I could say about that because I was involved in a lot of projects. So a couple of things that I would say. So I on the on the subject of how other people can limit people's aspirations, I saw it was up in a northern seaside town. I won't name it, and we had a project going between the university, which had a satellite campus out there, and the college. And the uh, the college brought in some kids on a vocational course just to sort of have a taster of university. And the team who were running that reported back to me. They said, "Well, we had a terrible time with the actual tutors because they were saying, oh, these kids won't amount to anything. I don't know why they're here because they're never going to go to university." And actually, the kids really got stuck in and did really well. And I think I'm not sure that's something that would happen now because this was maybe 20 years ago. But really, the feedback had to be given to the college. Look, the these kids can do things. They're 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 keen to learn if they've got the right opportunities. But I think I saw a kind of counter example to that in it was in York College. Um, some students on I did a evaluation interview with some students on a foundation degree, and they all of them said we would never have gone on to higher education. We would not be considering, sort of moving on to a full degree hadn't been for our tutors, because all the way through they said, you can do this, it's fine, we'll help you, you can go to university, you can do all these things. So I think just the influence of your teachers and your tutors is absolutely crucial. I think the other example I would give is about how parents can discover a sort of a second chance for learning if that's something that they need, because they're really ambitious for their kids, and we saw it particularly amongst mothers. So down in London, but also sort of up in the north, it's, if you see that your kids have opportunities that you didn't have, you kind of want to encourage them, but you want to help them as well. So that's a really kind of key moment to be introducing. Well, why don't you come and do this? We'll arrange it around when your kids are at school, and it could be just a little access course, and um, really kind of framing that round helping your kids. That's been a way into educate or back into education for sort of women with kids as well, and that transforms the whole family.
So you talked about your living black at university research
Yeah.
that's been ongoing. Um, Now, a lot of our listeners are clearly in higher education, student accommodation, so we'll be aware of it. But for those that aren't, talk about that work and the impact that that is going to have, or perhaps has already had.
Yeah. This it's quite a big project now, so I'll try and be concise about it. I feel like I've mainly just infused at you about all sorts of projects. So it went back to before the pandemic. I was doing a piece of research on something completely different, and I kept, because we had quite a diverse group of students in each of the focus groups, I kept just hearing little things from Black students that were sort of ringing a bell with me. I didn't really know what to make of them. Things like, or people assume I'm going to be aggressive because I'm Black. I wanted to know there was someone else like me, and I thought I don't know what this means, but it means something. There's something going on here. And I wonder what kind of experience Black students are having in their student accommodation, um, and whether there are some specific issues there, with how it compares to sort of the majority population. So that was the kind of the origin story, I suppose, of the research. But then it became an incredibly collaborative venture. So um, we sort of commissioned the research. My colleagues Sam Kingsley and Jen Stedman got on board. We did some great work there with the students, with Help in Partnership, who did the research, and we found out that there were some quite specific issues, um, particularly around being able to feel at home. There was a lot more racism than we thought, which was quite sad to hear. Um, and just, some very specific issues that were resulting in poorer mental health, less of a sense of community and belonging, which we know is really important among Black students, and just, really some culture shock issues as well from, particularly um, students who've lived in, somewhere like London, where there's a really big Black population. It's easy to get your hair care, it's easy to get the food that you're used to eating, and then you go to somewhere like Hull or Preston or something, and there's none of that. And you walk into a shop and everyone stares at you, and it's just, it's quite a difficult experience. So that was kind of the how it all started, and then we moved on to activating it, and we set up the commission, and then it's become sort of everyone's project, quite rightly. And universities and accommodation providers right across the country have really wanted to take action. So what we've been doing is trying to just set out some guidance and some toolkits to help people take that action. And then most recently, we've published just an overview of good practice, people's projects, how people have brought this to life for students. But we're going into the second phase. We're just about to announce the second phase of that, because the work is not done yet. Until Black students are having an equitable time, the work is not done.
And that was one of my questions. Is I'll try not to ask you lots of questions in one go. Is
I have a lot to say.
is how will you measure that, and in terms of them having an equitable experience at university, how will you know whether that's been successful, or is it the case that you can't measure that, you just want to see continuous improvement?
So we would like to repeat the survey, probably not this year, but in a future year, just to see how things have changed. So it was a representative survey across the whole of the sector. So it's a national level survey, and we want to repeat that. I think there is some work to be done in terms of assessing what sort of universities and private providers have done with this, so to understand the activity. But I think we do have to come back to the impact. I would also like to see if it has an impact on the awarding gap. So for those who don't know what that is, Black students come out of university with so there are I'm going to get this right, okay. There is a lower proportion of firsts and 2-1s amongst Black students than there are among white students. Now, that cannot be, because they are not as intelligent. That does not make sense. So what are the drivers to that? And most universities are doing something on the academic side with that and really sort of focusing on it, but it's an incredibly stubborn measure. We have not really seen progress on it. I think that what happens outside of the classroom, and I'm not the only one who thinks this, makes a big difference, because if your accommodation doesn't feel like home, if it feels hostile, if you're experiencing racism, that is going to affect your academic performance. Of course it's going to. So can we make a difference there, and can we be part of that real push to make a change on this awarding gap?
My other question around that is about the freedom you have within Unite to pursue these projects, as you call them, initiatives, research. Um, it's clearly that it's important, and it's become, you've been there for whatever 12 years, so it's clearly important to them that doing this work,
Yeah.
albeit you've done a few different roles. But how do you make your voice heard within Unite that this is particularly important and things need to change?
I don't really know. I feel like I've been pushing on an open door, and I thought really long and hard about going into the private sector, because before I worked for Unite, I'd worked in the public sector, I'd worked in the charitable sector, I'd never worked in the private sector, and I'd always felt like I probably never would. And then I did, uh, but I had to think about it, and I had to feel, and I said this at interview as well, that if I was going to come in and improve Unite's relationship with higher education, it's got to be sincere. We can't just be doing marketing. We can't just be saying the right things. We have to be doing the right things. We have to do the things that universities would want us to do. And they said, yeah, no, that's okay, you can do that. So I think that willingness was there from the start, and that's the basis on which I took the job. And I think I've probably pushed my luck on that, because I've managed to persuade people to do all sorts of things that feel maybe quite risky for a private sector business to be doing. But so far it's all gone very well, and I think that's just testament to how great our exec are and our board. They're really on board with it.
And a topic that I cover a lot alongside my passion for the living sectors is neurodiversity.
Yeah.
So I talked about my neurodiverse children many times on this podcast, and perhaps my own possible neurodiversity that I should really explore at some point. But how can the sector, or what is the sector doing around supporting neurodiverse people going to university, and maybe going into accommodation as well? Is that happening or not?
I think it's starting to happen. So it's something that I feel very passionately about as well. And I'm not going to go into specifics because they are teenagers, but it is a feature in my family as well. And maybe for me, but got this far. So, um, but yeah, so we did a piece of work last year. So it was about this time last year, on the experience of neurodivergent students in student accommodation. And it was really born from actually going to open days with my daughter and discovering that University of Bristol had its own student-led neurodiverse society. And we had a chat with them, and they were really amazing, and they'd sort of advocated for change, and they'd done all sorts of things. And I think that's what planted the seed of doing this piece of work. And we also had some data from our, I think it was from our applicant index, that suggested that neurodivergent applicants in particular were having a quite a challenging time and had specific needs, which we sort of knew anyway. So we brought that data together with some qualitative work in partnership with the Neurodivergent Society at the University of Bristol, and that was really good. I absolutely loved working with the students. Um, and we brought a report. It's quite a small report together, but my co-author was one of the students, Freya, and that was a great experience. And it feels like that's still at an early stage. So we've put it out there. I know that people are using it. It really sort of outlines the issues rather than necessarily sort of prescribing all the solutions. It's got some ideas of what could be done. And again, these were really very much delivered by the students themselves. But I think probably as a sector, we're still in the early stages there, and it would be good to think about how we could push that on.
And for those that aren't aware, you're, I think, you correct me if I'm wrong here, I'm sure you're, 1 day a week you are working with the DfE's Higher Education Mental Health Implementation Task Force. I got that right first time.
I
That
can't
was
say it
impressive.
even now. That's too much.
So we can come on to obviously
Yeah.
what that work is, but obviously it's focusing on 4 main areas, and I know there's a paper due, I think, in May to update on this. But um, talk to me a little bit about that and the progress that you've been making as a group and yourself on that.
It is a huge and very complex initiative, which, as I discovered last year, is quite challenging to be working on 1 day a week, because you're kind of having to switch in and out of it, and lots of complicated things have happened in the meantime. But um, I'm working with Professor Edward Peck, who is he's the Vice Chancellor at Nottingham Trent, but he's also the government student support champion, and it's been great working with him. He's so practical and so knowledgeable. So I'm just kind of supporting a couple of the projects on there. So the first part of the work that I did last year was a really broad consultation to see what else we should be doing as a task force. So we had some priorities and some projects, but my my brief was what else. So that was great because I got to talk to about 50 people, although it was incredibly mind-blowing trying to then condense this into some practical suggestions, because I heard everything that everyone thought about student mental health across the whole of the country, and it was like, I could make a Doctor Who analogy here, but I think it would be too complicated. So I'm going to just step back on that. But yeah, it is like trying to absorb all the dimensions at once in your brain. But for the remainder of the task force this year, so up till May, I'm just leading 2 small projects around. I don't know how much I'm allowed to say about this really, because I'm very conscious this is not my gig, but yes, I'm leading a couple of projects in the sort of learning development area, and a student compact as well.
We can say watch this space for
Student commitment, I think it is. Yeah.
we can watch this space for the
Yeah.
report that comes out.
Yeah, there's quite a bit already on the Student Support Champion website, so there'll be a slightly less cryptic version there, and there's a DfE website as well about the task force. But because it involves government, because it involves, it's led by others, it's not really my project to talk about. Other than that, I'm really happy it exists, and I'm really happy that I get to contribute to it, and it's just an opportunity to make a national difference to students, and just set things in place, set new practices and new norms in place that will really help take things forward.
So one thing when I was working in PBSO that we always struggled with, as a when I was working on site, but even when working as part of the corporate team, was what to define the role in supporting students' mental health for particularly site teams in PBSA, because there's it's more complex in my opinion than people think, because where you want to be a good person and help. That's
Yeah.
pretty normal, hopefully. Um, but also you have a responsibility to the organization that you work for, and balancing those things accordingly, and also not overstepping. I know we've seen conversations around when should universities talk to parents about a student
Mm.
suffering with poor mental health. So I wonder what your thoughts are around of what the role is, particularly for site team members in
Mm.
what should they be doing, or maybe even what shouldn't they be doing to support students with that are suffering with poor mental health.
Yeah, it's a very interesting question, that, Gareth, and that's really the question that we had to work out the answer to around about 2015, 2016, when we first started on this, because no one had really asked the question, back in those days, no one had really asked the question about that. I think we were quite early on this, and we got a lot of things wrong, to be honest. It was a really tricky time because we were trying to do something that no one had done. University partners didn't really know why we were doing it at the time. I mean, they do now, but at the time it's like, well, leave it all to us, just send them all to us. But you can't do that at 4 in the morning. You can't do that when you've got, you discover that you've got a member of your security staff who's spending 2 hours a night listening to a student because they are struggling with their mental health, and they're over reliant on this person. So I mean, you'll know, and everyone listening will know, kind of what can happen. So we had to work out the answers to these questions, and sort of we drew on existing staff. We had specialist staff come in. We drew on consultants to help us understand that. But we did eventually, I think, come to some conclusions which probably too long to talk you through now, but we did publish them as part of the British Property Federation guidance on student wellbeing, which you can, with a bit of judicious Googling, you can find it. It's not very prominent on their website now, but it you can Google it, and it was endorsed by the minister as well. So I think we got to a point of sort of defining um, the boundaries of the role, understanding what training people needed to have, understanding the protocols around disclosures and sharing data and so on. We're still working a little bit, I think, on data sharing, but I think there's kind of almost a rule set around that. Interestingly enough, one of the pieces of work that I am doing with the Mental Health Task Force now is looking at what that looks like in universities for sort of non-specialist staff like tutors and so on, and how you get to that point where you can be helpful and make a referral, but you've got your boundaries in place. You're not overstepping, you're not over serving, you're just doing the right thing by that student.
Well, we can find that link and post it in the show
Yeah,
notes.
well,
So
I'll
hopefully,
send that to you.
hopefully,
Yeah,
make it easier for
and
people to find.
yeah, and actually, to get a more coherent and up to date answer, you would have to ask my colleague Rebecca Hayhurst, because she's leading that now, and she's taken us on even further.
I want to talk to you about something completely different now, and that's
Great.
podcasts.
Yay. My
uh,
favorite thing.
so start with accommodation matters.
Yes.
Uh, why did you start it, and talk to people about if they haven't listened to accommodation matters.
Okay, so there's two different questions there. Why I started it, and there's a bit of a rambly answer to that. But I grew up listening to radio, and we had a very perfunctory television in my house. It was black and white, it was very small. So radio was always sort of my primary thing. I was very early to podcasts. I was an early listener to podcasts. I made a podcast in 2006.
Well,
So I absolutely adore podcasts. So that's why I started. I keep starting podcasts and being on podcasts. But the reason we started Accommodation Matters, funnily enough, it was one of my colleagues who suggested it. but it just seemed like there was a gap in the market for an accommodation podcast. So I think we were a little bit early. I think it's great now that there's so many, but I think we were a little bit early to the party there, and we had to work out what format was going to work. Now, I was quite instrumental in helping to set that up, but I wasn't the first presenter. We had the fabulous Darren Ellis as the presenter, and I just took over sort of more recently. But what was your second question now? I've forgotten now because I've just enthused about podcasts.
Oh no, I think you answered it talking about, and I think one thing, and we were talking before this episode about, what you discuss in a podcast, and I think, where it's really found its place for me, I can only speak for myself, is talking about issues that aren't investments, operation,
Yes, yeah.
rental growth, all those, like there's
Yeah,
plenty of
yeah,
podcasts talking all about that, actually talking about students and the issues that
yeah.
affect them. And I think that's definitely where that gap was, and you filled it very well.
Yeah, and I think it's just a product of what I'm interested in, because I'm not really interested in rental growth and things like that. But I'm really interested in students, and a lot of other people are as well. And I think that's where the awareness and the growth has been in the sector. When I went, I mean, it was 2012 when I first came into PBSA, and it was all about buildings and rental growth. And there was some talk of students, and I think local teams probably went under the radar with the good work that they were doing. But I don't think it had nothing like the profile that it does in the sector now. And it's been great to see how res life has sort of grown within this country. It was an American thing. Maybe 10 years ago, it was this is what Americans do. But the tradition of that sort of really holistic approach to the residential experience, was a part of our higher education sector, back in the 60s. So, maybe we invented it. And it's certainly what I experienced at Durham.
Yeah. And the other podcast I want to talk to you about is Handed Down,
Yeah.
which I've been listening to in preparation for this episode. So,
Oh, you're a brave man.
so for those that haven't listened to Handed Down, talk to me about that.
This feels weirdly like coming out of the closet, because I don't tend to talk about my strange musical interests much at work, but I'm starting to be a bit more open about it. And now, of course, I've got the podcast, so I can't hide. But so it literally came from a dream. I woke up one morning and I thought, I should start a podcast about the stories behind traditional songs. Now, this didn't come from nowhere, because I've been a folk musician all my life. Gosh, it's one of those things that is deeply unfashionable, maybe less so now, but I've always grown up with folk music. I've always sung and played instruments and made folk music. And I'm quite interested in the old sort of traditional songs. I didn't necessarily know a great deal about them, but I thought, I bet there's some really interesting stories behind them. And there were. And I love telling stories, and I love making music. So I just brought it all together. And it's just a combination of music and weird history and colourful characters and folklore, and my often quite feminist take on the songs as well. And yeah, it's just me having fun and doing the things that I really am interested in. A
Well,
few people are interested in it as well. It's got some listeners, but it is quite quirky, I think.
for someone that knows nothing about folk music, I've enjoyed particularly the Bessie Bell episode. I really liked
Oh,
that one. It
that
was
was a bit of a romp, yeah.
that was a fantastic story. Another thing I wanted to ask you about is, you told me when we were obviously researching the episode that
Yeah,
when you turned 30, you went to night school to get your English A level
I
because
did.
you'd always wanted to do it, and I wonder why that was. I know you talked about, adults
Yeah.
going back into education later on, but why was that important to you?
Because I I don't know. I'm trying to think back. I did I did maths, physics, and chemistry and all that for my A levels because I'd said my parents were scientists, and also I think that's what the clever kids did, and I had this identity as I'm a clever girl, Um, yeah. So, but I had to sort of close off things that I might have been interested in, and English was definitely one of them. And I had friends who did English A level, and I thought they were studying some, such interesting things. I was a little bit jealous, but I was on my path. But then it occurred to me, I think sort of late 20s, and just as I was turning 30, oh, I could just go and do this now. I could go and do my English A level and have a really great time. And I did have a really great time. I enjoyed it a lot. So yeah, that's why I did it.
So we'll come on to quick fire round questions now.
Oh
So
yeah.
if you could change one thing about the world, what would it be?
Now it would be our education system, and I know that Meggie Cara said something similar, but mine is a bit more profound because I've been really quite shocked at how much secondary school is teaching kids to pass exams. And I know why it is. It's because schools have targets that they have to hit, but it is just how to pass the exam. And I would change the education system so that it was about exploring the subject and exploring yourself and learning how to learn and discovery and how to cooperate, how to problem solve. I would change it fundamentally because this, you've got to do this and you've got to jump through this hoop and you've got to tick this off and then you'll get the marks in the exam. That's not an education. I'm just, I feel quite outraged about it. There's nothing I can do about it, but if I could change the world, that's what I would do.
I think many people would agree with you. I think,
Mm,
I enjoyed school, it's just my own personal,
mm, mm.
but I didn't enjoy exams. Much as
Yeah,
I find that job interviews very similar. Like my
yeah,
recalling a situation when put on the spot, like you have to do an exam, very similar to a job interview. Tell me about a time when you did this. You're like,
yeah,
I'm trying to think. My brain doesn't work like that. So yeah,
yeah,
I
yeah.
definitely agree.
But
Um,
I think when I was at school, it wasn't really like that. And we had some great teachers, particularly my English teacher, who, you know, she she had to sort of squash in, this is how you pass your exam. But it was really about, she was so enthusiastic about the text, the books and the poetry and everything. She really sort of instilled that love of it. And I think that's also why I went to do English A level eventually.
and if what advice would you give to someone who wants to change direction but doesn't know where to start?
So I would say take one step and see how it goes. But I'd say this to my kids a lot at the moment is, weigh things up, but take a decision, but just commit to the decision once you've taken it, because it usually there's very few completely wrong decisions, and you usually know if you're taking a wrong decision. But there are a lot of okay decisions. There's very few perfect ones. If you take a decision, absolutely commit to it, and then it will work out. So that's what I would also say.
And what's going to be your next big change?
I don't really know. Yeah, I really don't. And I was trying to think about this last night, but I spent a lot of my career thinking about the next step and really kind of striving and feeling frustrated and why aren't I here and why aren't I there? And somehow during the lockdown that all went away. And I feel like I'm incredibly lucky to have the job I have. I love what I do, and I just want to keep doing it. So for one of the first times in my life, I'm not trying to take a new step or do something different. I'm just sort of happy where I am. which is quite nice.
It is. And the final question, if you were to recommend a guest or more than one guest for me to speak to on Know Your Shift, who would it be?
Well, I'm so lucky that I work with so many really amazing women. So I've got a really long list
We like
of
long lists. That's good.
amazing women. But I think Sam Kingsley, definitely, who has been a real leading light in the Living Black at University work. She's just gone into consultancy. She would be an amazing guest. Another one would be Bernadette Cochonat, who is our head of international and is an incredible expert on international students. So
That's
there's
great.
two, but I have lots more.
Well, we'll definitely start with those two and try and get episodes. Jenny, I just want to say thanks very much for joining me on the podcast today. I know it
Thank
isn't
you.
easy to be a guest, particularly when I throw lots of different questions at you, but I think the best podcast episodes are where you learn something, and I've definitely learned a lot today, and I'm sure everyone listening
Thank you.
to it will. So yeah, thanks very much.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks, Gareth.